Hello, John Ryan here, Carvel maintainer. Wanted to talk about YTT overlays today. Overlays could be a little unintuitive. So yeah, if you've taken out overlays for a spin and you've been kind of frustrated, you're not alone. So what I wanted to do is demystify that by working through a progressive example. Really quick before we do that, these are the docs that talk about overlays. If you haven't seen this, they're really worthwhile. We try to be to the point, and this gives you an example of how to read an overlay. There's actually a whole bunch of examples of overlays in our playground. There's a reference manual. Anyway, this is all worthwhile looking at. I'm gonna keep this documentation up because we'll refer back to this, I bet. I usually do when I'm writing overlays. But let's just jump into some examples. So overlays are particularly useful when you don't actually have control over the source YAML. So you've got some upstream product that you're using their YAML. Say it's something like this. So I'll note it, I'll put in this upstream directory, upstream. It's like this one in particular. This has a deployment and a service. They're all tied together. And the deployment is running Nginx, and it's got a command specified and some ports, and there's 3 instances. Anyway, so then there's a service that is providing that domain name to reach that deployment. Okay, so let's begin by presuming that what we want to do is place our application in a kind of staging area. And the way that we would do that in our shop would be to put these resources in a staging namespace. Something like this. Cool. But the problem here is that I'm editing these upstream files. These are files maintained by some other team, and they're probably going to make improvements on it, changes of some kind. And if I'm editing these directly, I'm now going to have to keep track of those edits. And when I want to upgrade to their improved manifests, I have to replay those edits. And this is just going to turn into a whole bunch of maintenance. I don't want to have to deal with that. So instead, what I'd rather do is write a patch that I can apply on top of the upstream documents. And the way to do that in YTT is with an overlay. So let's do that. An overlay is a YAML document that has been annotated with an overlay matcher. In YAML, triple dash is the start of a document. Great. So the overlay match annotation has a couple of keywords. Let's take a look at the reference to get familiar. So the first is this by keyword, which is the criteria that we're going to match with. It's usually a function. There's a string option, but you're almost always using a function. And then the second is this expectation. And this is the number of items that our matcher expects to match. By default, it'll be 1. And there are a couple other keywords we'll get into later, but these are the main two right now is our by and expects. Let's come back here. Oh, wait. And we want to, in our case, what we want to do, the criteria is we actually just want to match on everything. So here we want to use this provided function out of the overlay module, use the all function. So let's do that. And in order to use those functions, we have to load that module. Okay. So this is like one of the most common error messages I need to parse when I'm running overlays. So let's take a minute to break this down. So the message is pointing at line 4, which is a document node. So I like to read the next part of the message, replacing the word nodes with that type. So expected number of matched documents to be 1, but was 2. What's going on here? It's saying the default expectation is 1, but there are actually 2 documents present. So this expects is default. So I want to match on more than one. So the way to do that is with this annotation here. So what's happening? Our overlay is being applied to each document in turn. And when you don't supply a value in YAML, the value is null. So it's attempting to merge our null document on top of what is a map. The content of this document is a map with a bunch of map items. But null merged onto a map or any value is null. And so that means this document gets merged into null. And then when this overlay is applied to this document, it gets merged to null. And so we have a bunch of null documents, and so there's no output. This is not what we want. What we want to do is patch into a piece of this map, specifically the metadata. We want to put a metadata key in here. So we'll do that next. Okay, this is looking better. And I'll put the null in for a moment just to make this explicit. Now, there are 2 parts to every overlay match. There's the matcher and then an action. The default action is to merge. I was just saying that before. And each node has its own pair of matcher and action. This one doesn't have any annotations, but they're implied since it's inside of an overlay, but they would look like this if we wrote them out explicitly. So that is, it would match, and when a matcher is annotating a map item, the default criteria is to match the key name. And as we saw before, the default expectation is that it would match exactly one map item in the target. And the default action is merge. Okay, we're getting there. Now we have we're touching on the metadata section, but we've been zeroing out, we've been merging over our null value on top of the map inside metadata. That's not what we want. What we want to do is add in that namespace. Okay, let's break this down again. Line 8, oops, line 9. Expected number of match nodes to be 1, but was 0. Well, let's put in our defaults again and see if that helps us. Okay, so this makes it really clear that our default expectation of 1 isn't going to work here because there is no namespace in this document. Well, it's not, there's no namespace in either one of these right now. So yeah, we can set our expectation to 0. And so that means that this matcher expects not to match any map item with the key namespace. And so it succeeds in it. It merges the map item namespace staging into the map on the left here. So this works great, except it's a little bit brittle because it's quite possible that even if it isn't happening today, that upstream they might actually include the namespace. That's not unreasonable. And at that point, our overlay is going to fail. And that's because when we attempt to match on this document, this will merge, the metadata will merge, and it'll get down to namespace. And our expectation is that there is no map item with the key namespace, but there will be exactly one. So in that case, we would want to replace it as well. So we can actually just specify that in the expectation that we can expect 0 or 1 map item that has that key. Now, this is such a common scenario that we actually have a special syntax for this, and that is this missing OK keyword. And this is just simply a shorthand for what we just wrote. And we find that it's more telling, more readable. And so there we go. So now we are, whether there's a namespace or not, we're ensuring there is a namespace and that it has our staging value. Now, there's a lot of annotations going on here, but the good news is a bunch of this stuff are just the defaults. So let's start with the actions. Merge is the default action. So we don't need to specify that in any of these nodes. Here we needed to configure the criteria and the expectation. We need to set this to greater than 1, so at least 1. So again, want to keep that. This is using the default criteria. There's no by keyword. And the expects is the default, so we don't need this annotation. It's implied. And then finally here, we do need this configuration to allow for the possibility that the namespace might already exist. So there we go. Now I think I want to change this name to be a little bit more intention revealing. There we go. Terrific. Okay, so there we go. We've got our first overlay in place. Okay, so now let's say we want to evolve this application and we want to have some session management. And if we were to include a Redis instance alongside our Nginx, that we could achieve that. So let's add in that container onto our deployment. We do the same kind of thing. Again, I'm going to write another overlay. And now I want to actually match not on all documents, but a very specific one. I don't want to match on the service. I want to match on the deployment. So let's see how we do that. So come back over here. And we see that there's more than just this overlay all. This function subset is really useful for selecting specific documents. So the way this works is to supply the shape, a portion of fragment that needs to be present in the target in order for there to be a match. And that's what this does right here. So we'll do that in our case. So we want to match on any document that has a map item whose key is kind and value is deployment. So let's write that out. So overlay dot subset. Oh, and we need that. We want to load the module. So we have access to this function. And so now we want to write that fragment. So we'll do this with what looks like JSON notation. Great. But this is actually just a Starlark dictionary where this is the key and this is the value. And it maps perfectly to map items in your YAML. So there's key and deployment. So we see here that this overlay is matching exactly one document, which remember is the default expectation. That's great. We'll keep that. And that it's merging. Remember that the default action is to merge. But the value of this overlay is null, and therefore it is merging null into this map, which is null. And so therefore we no longer see the deployment there. That's not what we want, obviously. But what we want to do is work our patch into the spec, template, spec, container section so that we can add in our new container. So let's do that. So spec, template, spec, containers. Okay, looking good. Now, of course, as we're merging our way down, each one of these has an implied overlay match, expects 1, and an operation that is
the merge. Now, as you can see, this would get really verbose if we write these explicit, if we write in the defaults here. But we'll clean this up when we get done. Just in case we have problems, it's nice to have the defaults there. Okay. And so now we want to actually add our Redis container to the list of containers to run in this pod. So we give it a name. We identify the container image and name the ports that it'll listen to. So far we've been annotating documents and map items. This is the first time we've added an array item. That's this thing. This whole thing is an array item. I can tell because there's this little leading dash. So what are the defaults there? They're slightly different for array items. With a map item, the overlay match, the default criteria is to match on the corresponding map item up here that has the same key. Well, arrays don't have that. They have indexes. So instead of assuming to know which item is expected to match, YTT will actually assume a criteria of not matching at all. And instead of the action being an overlay merge, it's an overlay append. So it turns out that those defaults are perfect for our situation. What we wanted to do is keep the Nginx intact and just add the Redis, and that's exactly what's happening. So the defaults are working just great for us. So I'm going to do the same thing of clearing out any of the defaults. I just wrote all this stuff in, but I just wanted to make clear that at each step, there are these annotations. But when we see the resulting annotation, this is much more readable. It's just which document needs to be overlaid and what is the contents, each map item being merged, and then the array item getting appended. Terrific. Okay, so now let's say that we've learned that there's a new version of Nginx available, and the upstream team hasn't yet adopted it, but we actually want to take advantage of some of those features. Let's say it's like Nginx 1.19 or something. And so what we want to be able to do is select on uh, that version of the image. So how would we do that in an overlay? So let's add another one. Okay. So we're going to want to match on the exact same document we did before. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and actually all the way down to the containers. And I might be tempted to actually put these two overlays together, and in the end maybe I would, but for now, just for clarity and simplicity, I'm going to keep these separate. But I don't have to be creating a brand new a brand new file for every single overlay. You can have a bunch of overlays in a single file. But here we want to keep the motivations. I'm using files to document the motivation here. So I want to upgrade Nginx. Okay. So let's see, we've got 3 overlays being applied here, and we can look at the deployment. We see that the containers is null. Okay, right, because all along the way we're doing this overlay match merge, and down here the value of a node in a YAML document is null if it's not specified. So that's what that is. But that's not what we want. What we want to do is match on this guy. So what we'll do is use that same matcher we used before. The subset is useful in all kinds of places. So what we want to do is create an array item that contains just the improvement that we want to make, just the change we want to make. And we want to only apply it on top of the Nginx item. So what we want to do is include this image.
Okay. Okay, and so let's take a look at what we've got here. So now we've got in containers, we have one, two, oh, three. Okay, so we remember that without any explicit configuration, the default matching for an array item is to not match on any item in the array and to append. So this is what the default behavior is. What we want to do is actually match on this first item. So that's what we'll do. We'll throw a matcher here. Okay. And so we want to match on an array item that has the name Nginx. Okay, looking back here, now we see that there are, now two containers and we have, but I didn't change this. We need to upgrade. Let's do the upgrade. All right. So now our Nginx container is using the 1.19 image and we can take advantage of all those features. Okay, and months pass, everything's going great, service is working wonderful. But then as we start to add more pieces to our overall system, more things get into the cluster, we start to have some pod scheduling conflicts. We do a little bit of research and come to find out, it looks like for whatever reason, the upstream team has made a commitment to specifying which host port the Nginx container is going to listen on, when in general you don't need to specify that value. Now they have reasons that they want to do that, but those aren't our reasons. That actually doesn't apply to us. So what we want to do is get rid of that map item, get rid of that host port. So to date, we've just been adding things, but now what we want to do is remove that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to write an overlay that targets this map item and removes it. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So I'm going to grab this whole preamble. This will be remove host port. Okay, so we're matching on just deployments, great, just our deployment, and all the way down to the containers list. So far, so good. And then we're going to want to match on the container whose name is Nginx. And then within that, we want to match on the ports map item. Okay, so I'll put that here, ports. We only need to put the portion that the portion of the path down the hierarchy that we're trying to edit. All right, so that's ports. And then within ports, we want to locate the port that has a container port of 80 and remove its corresponding host port. Now, there's only one right now, but ports is an array. So we want to be careful. We want to just find the one that has this is the container port, and then remove that host port. So let's put these in. I'm going to just copy both these down. Okay. Okay. So I don't want to necessarily include this. I want to turn this into the matcher. That's the port that I want to actually match on. So I'll use our trusty subset function. And so I'll grab our container port. This is our map item key name, and this is the value. Gets a little bit here, a little bit of space. There we go. All right. So now we should be matching on the container, the port that has a container port of 80. Come back up here. Oh yeah, let's just go ahead and the value here doesn't matter, but I want to know that I'm actually matching on it. So I'm going to put a null there. And great. Okay, so we've got a set of matchers. We've got a path down to this item. Now, up to this point, we've been using the overlay merge, and we looked at the overlay
append. But what options do we have available to us? Let's look at the docs. So come back here, we go to the top of the page. We can see that in the reference, we have matching annotations, which is just these two. And then here are all the actions available to us. So we've seen merge, we've seen append. What we want is this one, overlay remove. And this deletes the node from the matched document. So let's add that in. Overlay remove. Great. Okay. So we come up here and oops, we've got a serious problem. It's not just removing the host port, it removed everything. What's going on here? So the issue here has to do with how annotations find the node that they're attached to. What do I mean? I mean, here, this document has an annotation above it. We've been thinking about that annotation describing or annotating that node. Same thing here with this matcher on this array item. And what we're expecting is for our remove to be matching on our map item, but it's not. Let's find out what the story is here. So back in our docs, we actually have a really nice page that orients us on YAML structure and how YTT applies annotations on top of that. So this document has two parts. The first part is details about the terminology and the structure of YAML documents. This is a great refresher, even if you've dealt with YAML before. And then the second half is how annotations are attached to that structure. So, and within that, we actually have a called out section on exactly this topic, how an annotation finds its node. Which node does an annotation match on? It's simple, thankfully. There are two rules. The first is if the annotation has a node on its left, like for example, right here, this is considered an annotation. And if you look to the left of it, there's a node. Then this annotation is considered attached to this node. In this case, this is a map item, and this expression is attached to that map item. If that is not true, if there is no node to the left of the annotation, then the annotation will attach to whatever the next node is that's below it. So an example back here is in this case, this overlay replace does not have a node to the left of it. There's nothing to the left of it. And so it also attaches to that same map item. So let's see an example that's a little bit closer to what we're dealing with, which is annotating inside of an array item. So here, in this case, we wanted to have this annotation attached to this map item. And in order to do that, we needed to make sure that the annotation doesn't have any nodes to the left of it. So we put a blank space there. Without that blank space, this annotation would actually attach to the array item because if there were no blank space here, that array item would be just to the left of the annotation. But with it moved down one, now there's nothing to the left of it, and so it will now properly attach to this map item. Okay, so let's use that knowledge and fix our overlay. So here, right now, this is a remove that's being applied to our array item. If we just put that space in there, now this remove applies to the host port. And that's exactly what we see. The container port remains, but the host port is removed. Fantastic. And now these containers can be scheduled on any node. All right, and this brings us to our final scene in our overall story. What's happening now is everything's working great, but from time to time, we found that some parts of this particular service is a little bit flaky, and we wish that we had the ability to sometimes be able to turn on or turn up debugging on our app here. We don't always want it on, but when we do, we want all of our components to go into a debug mode. So what would that mean? What does that look like? Well, it means different things for different pieces. So for example, in the Nginx case, the way to enable the debug mode is actually to run the debug binary. So we would want to add this suffix to the Nginx command. So that's that piece. But we wouldn't want to turn on debugging just for the Nginx. We actually want logging to be turned up for the Redis server as well. In here, what we want to do is actually it's using the default command, but what we want to do is include turn up the logging level. And so we would want to add the command key, and in here include the Redis, the binary, and then pass in the log level, turn up the log level to debug on the Redis server itself. So we've got a couple edits that we want to make in a couple different places. Now, we could just add this to we could add the debugging to the caching, but then that means every time we turn on caching, we include Redis, it's always going to be in debug mode. That's not what we want. What we want to do is when the caching is enabled, turn on that debugging. So this is a really interesting situation. So this is how we want this normally to occur, the configuration for Redis normally. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to take these one piece at a time. What we want to do first is add that suffix to the Nginx debug, add the debug suffix to the command. All right, so we're going to do yet another overlay. Okay, and here this is going to be enable debug. Cool. And again, we've just spent a lot of time, and this is fine, targeting our deployment. So we'll actually let's use the whole thing here, all the way down to here. Okay, and I know that there's going to be a couple containers that we want to edit. It's okay, let's just focus on just one at a time. So here we want to first focus on the Nginx. Great, we're targeting that. And now what we want to do is go into the command list. Okay, and within that command, we want to be able to find and edit this item, this line. And I mean, I guess I could assume that it's the first one, but it would be safer if I matched exactly on the contents here. So, delightfully, we can continue to use our subset matcher. And so let's see. So what we're going to do is we want to match on a command. And here we can actually just put in the exact match. So this is good for an exact matcher. And maybe I'll just put in something here to make sure that this is working. It's not yet. Okay, so let's see. Again, there's a lot of text here. I start from the back and work my way in. So on line 12, we're expecting to have matched 1, but matched 0. So line 12 is this. So we're saying we're trying to match on engine. Oh, if I spell it correctly, it might match better. There we go. And yeah, we can see now that instead of the Nginx command, we have this, but we don't want to replace it. We want to add the suffix to it. So what we can do is instead of replacing that, we want to um, rewrite it. So let's go back to our list of actions. Again, we've been playing with merge and append, and we just did remove. Now here's this one, replace. And what replace lets you do is not just replace the entire contents, but actually provide an expression, a function that takes in what the existing value is and what value you have in your overlay, and you can combine those together any way you like. And the result of that expression is what gets placed in the final output. So let's use that. So here we're going to overlay replace, and the keyword is via. And now we want to define a function. And in Starlark, you can actually declare a function literal using this syntax, the lambda syntax. So the documentation is telling us you simply need to provide a function that takes two parameters, the left, which is the original document, and the right, it'll get past whatever the contents are that are in the overlay itself. And you could return any value you want. So let's do that. We're going to write a lambda left right. So lambda original in the overlay. And what we want to do in our case is we want to take this value and then add a suffix to it. And so this would be this guy. So we would just say left plus right. So Nginx plus debug. We come up here and we see we've successfully edited this. We can put any expression we want in here. We could have prefixed it with something if we'd like. We can do whatever kind of edits we want. So this is a really powerful way of editing an individual item with an overlay. All right, so far so good. So now our Nginx is in debug mode. What about our Redis? Well, since our intention is to enable debugging, we can actually include both of the edits for our containers in the same overlay. So I'm going to actually, unlike what I've done above, is keeping these separate because their intentions have been different. I want to illustrate to whoever's reading this that there's two edits. There is the change to the Nginx and the change to the Redis. So let's start matching on the Redis container over here. Let's see, is that the name of it? Look here, name is Redis. Great. Okay. And so we know what we want to do is add in a command and include let's say Redis server, and then we want to turn up the logging level to debug. Cool. Let's see what we got here. Okay, wow. So line 16 on the command, expected match nodes to be 1 but with 0. What's line 16 here? So line 16 is the command map item. So if I look to see what I'm overlaying on, there is no command map item. So what I want to say is, well, if it's not present, then just add it. Okay. Overlay match missing. Okay. Right. Okay, and we know from our adventures with the host port that if we intend this annotation to decorate this map item, we better make sure that there's no node to the left of it. So I'm going to put the blank space there, and so now this is applying to the command. We'll come back up here. Hey, look at that. That's fantastic. So this is great. Now, it's great, except that what I really care about in terms of the debugging is that this flag get added. I had to add this command because it wasn't present. But what if I want to start adding commands up here? I still want to be able to match there. So, so what I want to do is make this overlay a little bit more durable, a little bit more resilient to changes that could occur upstream. It's quite possible that there isn't a command right now for the Redis container, but there could be. And um, and I wouldn't want this overlay to break just because somebody is making improvements to this overlay. Let me demonstrate. So maybe what I want to do here is include this command, Redis server, and maybe we're specifying the port explicitly. And when we have that, now we see where there's a little bit of a trouble. So now we've got not a great command line, one that's not going to work well. What I wished was happening was that this part of the command would only appear if it isn't already in the list, and that the overlay would add just this item. But I'm showing a future possible state. So this command won't be there for now. I just want to be tolerant if it does show up later. So here's what I can do. This item I want to be effectively optional. I want it to be there only if there isn't already a Redis server command. So what I'm going to do is say include this only if I can't find a array item that matches this. And it goes a little something like this. So what I want to do is include a custom matcher. What do I mean by that? Let's go back to our documentation for the overlay match. And we've been using these out of the box functions. They're super useful. You can see we've gotten a lot of mileage out of them, but now we're getting into a zone where we want to do more. And this is where the custom overlay matcher function. So just like the overlay replace, we simply need to provide a function. And this one, the signature is just slightly different. This signature is 3 arguments. The first that our function will receive is an index or key. So as the overlay is attempting to match on different items, we're actually provided, if it's an array, what the index is, or if it's a map, what the key is that we're currently looking at. So that is input provided. The next is, what is the total value of the existing item? So that's what left is. And then the right is whatever we are annotating over. This is the value inside of our overlay on which the matcher is annotating. And it should provide, it's a predicate. It should describe whether or not we match. So the expression for this function should decide whether or not we're matching. Okay, so armed with that, we're going to write another Lambda function, and it's going to take an index, the left side, that's an L, and the right side. I'm going to keep this short so that it's a little bit easier to read on this smaller space. So I'm not really going to use the index. What I care about is that if there is, I'm going to try and match on the existing presence of the Redis server command. So what I'll say is, well, if the left, now that's a string, and I deliberately try to make it so that they aren't going to match exactly. What I want to do is I want to see if the value that I have here is present anywhere inside of the left side. So let's go look to see if we can get some help on this. So inside the custom overlay matcher function, there's some examples, and we have some references that we find useful. So here, when you're doing string matching, you can actually use some built-in functions that Starlark provides on string values. Here, if this will match if the metadata name has the server suffix. All right, but for us, what I want to do is look at the string functions that are available on string. So I follow that link. And these are all of the built-ins that are available on strings. It's worth getting acquainted with these for such a case. For us, what we're looking for is being able to find a string within another string. And that's what find is all about. So the way find works, we click through. Now we're in the Starlark spec, looking at the original definition, and it says it's going to return the index of the first occurrence of the passed in substring on the main string. If the occurrence is not found, then we get a -1. Okay, so here we want to say within what's present, if we can find, sorry, the value being annotated here, Redis server, if that is greater than -1, that means that we've matched. Now, what we want to do is only include this if we don't match. So the way to do that is provide a predicate for matching and then use this other feature in overlays. Let's go back to our matcher. And this is our final keyword here. Once we've go through this, we have covered all the keywords for this annotation. What this when keyword will do is it will decide whether or not the overlay is going to apply. You could provide it a number or a string. This looks very familiar. This is a lot like expects. Or the criteria like giving a list of numbers, just like we saw with expects. So what this means is if we have 0 matches, and only if we have 0 matches, then include this. Otherwise, do nothing. So if we find Redis server in the list of commands, then do nothing. But if we don't find it in any of the commands, then include this one. So scroll back up here and we can see, aha, great. Since the original source included Redis server, even though it didn't exactly match, it was just present, then that's just left alone. There's no additional Redis server command. The original port is specified and the debug is included. Terrific. Now we can either put a switch behind this overlay or decide whether or not we include this overlay on the command line in order to enable debugging. But what we've done here now is encapsulated a set of edits required in order to turn on debugging.